Have you ever seen something that didn't feel right, but you kept walking, telling yourself it wasn't your place to interfere? Maybe it was a kid sitting too quietly in a booth, or a man watching someone just a little too closely. We've all passed those moments, brushed them off, called them none of our business. But what if that moment was everything? What if that one glance, that tiny gut feeling, was the only chance someone had? This is a story about noticing, about choosing not to look away, and about the life that was forever changed because one man decided to stop.
Frank wasn't planning on being a hero that afternoon. He just wanted a break, maybe a refill, maybe 5 minutes without the hum of the highway under his wheels. That's all it was supposed to be. He'd pulled into a half-forgotten rest stop off Highway 27, a place he'd driven past 100 times and never once remembered afterward. That kind of place, the kind built to be invisible, and it would have stayed that way, forgettable, if he hadn't looked left instead of right. It took him exactly 3 seconds to spot them. A young black girl in a red dress sitting stiffly in one of the booths by the window. Across from her, a white man in a suit, maybe in his 50s. Nothing loud about the scene. No one was arguing. No one was crying. They weren't talking either. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. Frank had seen a lot of silence in his time. In war zones, in VA waiting rooms, in late-night gas stations 200 miles from anything that smelled like home. But there was silence. And then there was this. The kind that makes your gut whisper before your brain catches up. He watched. Not long. Just long enough to register the details the way a Marine does when the stakes might be life or death. The girl didn't move much, didn't touch her food. The man, Greg, he would later learn, was holding a newspaper but barely reading it. His eyes kept lifting just above the fold, always landing on her, like she might vanish if he looked away too long. Or worse, try to. Frank wasn't the paranoid type. He'd spent enough years in uniform to know what real danger looked like. He also knew better than to go chasing ghosts, but something about that pair set off alarms he hadn't heard in years. Not loud, just insistent. Just enough to plant him near the vending machines instead of heading straight for the door. He told himself it could be nothing. A niece and her uncle, maybe. A foster dad, a mentor, a random act of familial awkwardness in a public setting. God knew families came in all shapes now. Race didn't mean much on its own. Age gaps, same thing. Maybe the girl was tired, maybe she was shy, maybe he was just seeing things because he'd been out on the road too long. That had happened before. But he couldn't stop watching. Couldn't stop noticing the way the girl's eyes never stayed in one place for too long, like she was trying to track exits without being obvious about it. Or the way Greg's movements felt just a little too measured, too deliberate. Like a man playing normal instead of just being it. Frank took a step back, leaned against the cold metal of the vending machine, sipped the worst cup of coffee he'd had in months, and tried to let it go. Tried. Didn't succeed. Because then it happened. The girl raised her hand just a few inches off the table, palm out, fingers spread. A movement so small it could have been missed. He caught it anyway. He'd seen that signal before. Once, on a training video buried inside a seminar nobody paid attention to. A silent call for help. Designed for people who couldn't speak, who were too scared to. Women trapped in violent homes. Kids in custody battles gone sideways. Victims being moved from one kind of hell to another. Frank blinked, looked again. The girl was still. The man hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had. But now Frank couldn't unsee it. Couldn't unknow what he knew. He told himself again that he might be wrong, that if he acted he could cause real problems, false accusations, legal trouble, the kind of mess that could ruin lives. But if he didn't act, and she was in trouble, that was worse. That was forever worse. He stayed put, didn't blink, didn't breathe much either. He ran through options in his head. Approach the man? Too risky. Could escalate fast. Alert the staff? They weren't watching. Call the cops? Might be overreacting. But what if he wasn't? Then her eyes found his, just for a second. But it was enough. There was something in them that stopped his thoughts mid-loop. Not panic, not sadness. It was sharper than that. The kind of quiet that follows someone into adulthood and doesn't ever fully leave. He'd seen that look before, in Kabul and Fallujah, and kids who had to grow up too fast. It wasn't something a child should know how to wear. He didn't move. Not yet. He needed one more sign. Just one. something that would let him act without hesitation, because the moment he did, there'd be no going back. He stayed. The man sipped his drink, turned another page, never glanced Frank's way. The girl dropped her eyes, but her hand twitched once more. Barely, but enough. Frank's coffee had gone cold. His heart hadn't. He turned slowly, walked toward the counter again, asked for a sandwich to go. Something to buy him time. He didn't look at the man, didn't look at the girl, but his ears were listening. Every sound, every shift, every breath between them. He knew the shape of a trap before it sprung. This felt like the edge of one. If he was wrong, he could apologize later. If he was right, that girl needed someone who noticed, someone who stopped, someone who stayed. Frank sat back down in the corner near the vending machines, sandwich untouched. He didn't take his eyes off the pair. The booth by the window hadn't changed. Same stillness, same wrongness humming beneath the surface. Zoe, that was her name, he'd find out later, kept her hands on the table now, fingers tapping a rhythm that didn't match the room. Greg, the man in the suit, had gone back to hiding behind his newspaper, but Frank could tell he was watching. He wasn't reading. He was waiting. Every few minutes, Zoe's gaze would lift, just barely, like she was checking if Frank was still there. He made sure she knew he was, not by staring, just by being a steady presence, not leaving, not looking away. If she sent another signal, he'd catch it. He was sure of that now. He'd been trained for chaos, for gunfire and sudden detonations. This was different. It was the slow kind of danger, the kind that slips through cracks, the kind people excuse. She's probably shy. He's probably her uncle. It's probably nothing. Frank had heard probably too many times to trust it. He'd seen what happened when people waited for confirmation, when they talked themselves out of acting. He still carried the weight of one mistake like that. A child in Kandahar, a delay, a consequence. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. The waitress brought his sandwich in a paper bag. He nodded, said thanks, acted like he was on his way out. But he stayed planted. The girl hadn't signaled again. She hadn't moved at all, really. That worried him more than anything. The man leaned across the table, said something to her. Frank couldn't hear the words, but whatever they were, they made Zoe flinch. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't obvious. But something shifted. She went still, smaller. Greg kept his voice low, calm, performed the part of a patient guardian. An act. Frank didn't buy it for a second. He thought about calling 911 again, this time making it official. But he hesitated. What if this was a misunderstanding? What if Zoe just didn't want to be there? What if Greg really was her uncle or foster dad or something that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny? Frank could cause a scene, could damage reputations, could blow up someone's life. But then he remembered her eyes, and the hand signal, and the timing of it all. Frank set the bag on the table next to him, watched the clock. Minutes passed like hours. The tension didn't let up. The whole diner was just white noise now. People talking, forks tapping plates, the slow drag of wheels across the linoleum. None of it reached him. He thought about getting up again, thought about walking over, asking Greg a simple question. But anything he said could blow the moment wide open. The wrong word might send the man into flight, or worse, fight. He needed confirmation. One more sign. Just one. And then it happened. Zoe looked up, slowly. Her eyes swept the room, stopped on him. Then she raised her hand again. Same motion, palm out. Fingers splayed. Not a nervous twitch, not a stretch, a signal, deliberate, direct. And this time, it didn't waver. Frank's decision snapped into place. He stood, not fast, not slow, moved toward the exit, but only halfway. He wasn't leaving. He just needed a better view, a different angle, one that let him see the parking lot, the booth, and the door all at once. His mind was already running scenarios. If Greg got suspicious, he might bolt. If Zoe tried to run, she might not make it. If this turned into something messy, Frank had to be ready. He touched his phone again. Not to scroll, not to hesitate. He dialed. The dispatcher picked up. "I need to report something," he said, voice even. "Possible child abduction. Emberfield rest stop off Highway 27. Young black girl, maybe 8 years old. Red dress, with an older white male, navy suit. Something's wrong. She's been signaling for help." He gave descriptions, timelines, behavior patterns. The dispatcher asked if the child was in immediate danger. Frank said he didn't know, but the urgency in his voice did the rest. They told him officers were en route. He didn't hang up right away. He stayed connected until they told him help was coming. Then he lowered the phone, returned it to his pocket, and leaned against the brick wall by the entrance, watching. Inside, Greg and Zoe hadn't moved. The booth looked the same, but everything had changed. Frank didn't feel relief. Not yet. Not until lights showed up. Not until uniforms walked in. Not until Zoe was out of that booth, out of Greg's reach, and safely away from whatever this man thought he was going to do. He waited and waited. And then Greg moved. He grabbed his jacket, looked at his watch, said something to Zoe that made her head drop. Frank's grip tightened. If Greg tried to leave now, if he got to the car before the cops did, this could end badly. He shifted position, ready to intercept, ready to block the exit if needed. He wouldn't escalate unless he had to, but he wouldn't let Greg take her. And then, faint at first, the sound of sirens. Getting closer. Frank exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. Help was coming. Now the real part began. The sirens rolled in like a warning bell nobody could ignore. Frank didn't move, didn't signal, just stood by the entrance, his posture casual, his eyes locked on the man now pulling Zoe by the arm. Greg wasn't in a rush, not yet, but he was alert. His eyes darted toward the window, toward the sound. He hadn't seen Frank again yet. He didn't know the game had already changed. Zoe didn't resist. She didn't say anything, just let herself be led, quiet and small. But Frank saw the way she glanced once more toward him before they reached the door. She knew what those sirens meant, and so did Frank. The cruiser pulled into the lot. Then a second. No flashing lights. No sirens now, just presence. Quiet, heavy, unmistakable. Greg hesitated. That moment of pause, that half beat between control and panic, was all Frank needed. He stepped inside before Greg could reach the door. The air shifted. The diner, once a backdrop of quiet conversations and background noise, suddenly went still. No one knew what was happening, not yet, but they could feel it. Greg turned. His eyes met Frank's. Recognition flickered. Frank didn't say a word, just walked forward, slow and sure, the way someone does when there's no room left for pretending. Zoe didn't move. One officer entered behind Frank, then another. The room didn't erupt, but something underneath it cracked. The kind of crack that split silence wide open. Greg's face changed. He let go of Zoe's arm, too quick, too smooth, like he'd never been holding her to begin with, like it was all a misunderstanding, like he was innocent. "Sir," the officer said, tone low, calm, firm. "Step aside, please." Greg didn't. Not right away. His face twisted into something between confusion and indignation. "What's this about?" he said, voice high and pleasant. "We're just grabbing a bite. There a problem, officer?" He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere real. Frank kept his eyes on Zoe. The officer tried again. Still calm, still firm. "We've received a report. Need to ask you a few questions. What's your relationship to this child?" Greg looked down at Zoe. His smile faltered. "I'm her uncle," he said smoothly. "We're traveling together. Her mom's busy." Zoe didn't look at him. She didn't say anything. That silence rang louder than any siren. Frank stepped forward just enough to close the distance. He wasn't interfering. Not technically. But he wasn't about to let Greg maneuver. Not now. Not when everything was balancing on what came next. The second officer knelt slightly beside Zoe. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "are you okay? Is this man your uncle?" Zoe looked up. Her eyes moved between Frank and the officer and then back to Greg. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But after a long pause, she shook her head. Just once. Greg's body tensed. Frank saw it. The calculation. The flicker of a fight-or-flight reflex. Before he could act on it, the first officer stepped in. "All right," he said, voice harder now. "Sir, I need you to step over here with me." Greg lifted his hands like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "This is a mistake," he said quickly. "She's confused. I'm not a stranger. We've spent time together. Her mother knows." "She said no," the officer cut in. "We need to verify your story." Greg tried to hold the performance together, but it was unraveling. Frank watched him closely. This wasn't a man surprised. This was a man cornered. The officers separated them. One led Greg away, not cuffed yet, but clearly not trusted. The other stayed with Zoe, offering her water, asking more questions. Frank didn't approach. Not yet. He waited. He knew what came next would be crucial. Greg's story began to crack almost immediately. No ID, no court documents, no emergency contact for Zoe. When asked for the mother's number, Greg hesitated, then gave one. It rang to voicemail, twice. Inside the diner, tension shifted. People had returned to their meals, but the undercurrent remained. They weren't watching openly, but they knew something had almost happened. Something real. Something ugly. Frank finally approached when the officer beckoned. "You were the one who called?" Frank nodded, gave his name, his background, his reason. The officer listened, no interruptions, wrote it all down. When Frank described the hand signal, the officer stiffened. "We've had a few trainings on that," he said. "You did the right thing. A lot of people wouldn't have noticed or wouldn't have believed it." Frank didn't respond. He didn't need praise. He just needed to know she was safe. Zoe was sitting now, sipping from a juice box. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't watching the door anymore either. Another officer came back from the squad car. "We're running Greg's name now," he said to his partner, "but his story's already falling apart. No legal custody, nothing that connects him to her on paper." That was the first moment Frank let himself breathe. Not relief, just confirmation. He'd been right. He hadn't imagined it. He hadn't overreacted. The girl had needed help, and he had stayed. The ride to the station wasn't loud. Nobody talked much. Frank followed in his own car, eyes never leaving the cruiser ahead. He wasn't law enforcement anymore, never had been, but he felt pulled along by something larger than responsibility. This wasn't about duty. It was about seeing it through. At the station, everything moved faster. Greg was separated and processed. Zoe was taken inside by a female officer who spoke in calm tones. Frank stayed back, watched from a distance, didn't insert himself. He knew better. This wasn't his scene to run, but it wasn't over either. The waiting room smelled like cleaning product and vending machine coffee. An officer came out to take Frank's statement. He gave it, straight and clear, nothing added, nothing exaggerated. What he saw, what he didn't, what he noticed, what he suspected. Every detail about the hand gesture, the tension between them, the way Zoe responded when asked. They listened, wrote it all down. No disbelief, just quiet professionalism, the kind that told Frank they knew how close this had come to being something unfixable. Time passed. Greg was still yelling somewhere in the back. His voice came and went like waves through drywall. "I'm her father. You don't know what you're doing. She wanted to come with me." The kind of lies that crack under pressure, the kind built on panic. Officers moved in and out, their expressions getting tighter the more they learned. The female officer returned, this time walking with purpose. She sat down beside another detective, whispered something, then turned toward the desk. "Frank," she called, "come with me." He followed her through a side hallway into a quieter room. Zoe was inside, sitting on a bench, her feet not touching the ground. She looked up, recognized him immediately. Something shifted in her shoulders. Not much, but enough. "She asked if you could stay nearby," the officer explained quietly. "She seems to trust you." Frank nodded once, took a chair in the corner, didn't speak, just stayed. Zoe spoke to the officer in small pieces, no full sentences at first, then a little more, enough for the picture to come into focus. Greg wasn't her father. He wasn't even a legal guardian. He was her mother's ex-husband. Her mother, according to Zoe, had lost custody months ago after a court case. She'd been living with her real father ever since. The pickup from school that morning wasn't planned. No one had called ahead, no permission, no warning. Greg just showed up, said it was a surprise, said her mom missed her, said it was okay. Zoe said she didn't believe him, but he smiled too much, talked too fast, got angry when she hesitated. She said no at first. He said she didn't have a choice. That's when he took her. Frank sat there, fists clenched under the table, doing his best to keep everything inside. This was no miscommunication, no family misunderstanding. This was abduction, plain and simple, and he'd almost missed it. Another officer came in with new updates. Frank only caught pieces, but the words hit like gunshots. No custody rights, forged documents, airport plan, exit route international. They weren't just grabbing lunch, they were running. If they'd made it to the next county, if they'd hit the highway, Zoe would have vanished into the cracks like so many others. And no one would have known until it was too late. Another hour passed. Frank stayed put. Then the door slammed open and a man rushed in. Tall, unshaven, eyes wide with panic. He didn't say a word, just scanned the room like his life was on the line. "Zoe." She turned toward the voice like it was a switch. "Daddy." She jumped from the bench and ran. No hesitation, no doubt. The officer stepped aside. No need to question it. Frank stood up but stayed in the background. Watched as Zoe reached her father and wrapped around him like gravity itself had been reversed. He dropped to his knees, held her, said something Frank didn't hear. The words didn't matter. The moment did. It was over. Not the legal part, not the aftermath, but the nightmare. That part was done. Greg was in custody. Zoe was safe. And the pieces that had almost shattered beyond repair were slowly being put back together. Frank left the room to give them space. Another officer caught him on the way out. "She's lucky you were there," he said. Frank didn't answer, just nodded and walked down the hallway, past the ringing phones and clattering keyboards, past the noise of paperwork and process, and all the machinery that came after rescue. He'd come in a stranger. He was leaving changed, not because of what he did, but because of what almost didn't happen, because of what almost slipped through, because of how easy it would have been to keep walking. He pushed the door open and stepped into the night. Cool air, empty street, just the sound of tires rolling slow across wet pavement. His car was where he left it. The keys sat in his palm. But he didn't get in. Not yet. He leaned against the door, looked back at the station, and let the weight of the day settle across his shoulders like something earned. He hadn't planned to stop, but he had. And that had made all the difference. Inside the station, things didn't slow down. They sharpened. Officers moved from desk to desk with urgency that didn't need volume. Phones rang, printers buzzed, keyboards clattered, and somewhere in the back, Greg's voice kept flaring up, less confident now, more desperate. His bravado had cracked. His lines were starting to blur. Frank stayed nearby, but out of the way. He watched the rhythm of the place, the way momentum started to shift. People stopped looking at Greg like a man in a misunderstanding and started looking at him like a suspect with intent. The father, Zoe's father, was now in a side room giving his statement. He'd come straight from work, still in his uniform from the warehouse, hands trembling when he signed the intake sheet. He hadn't even known Zoe had been picked up. He wasn't late. He wasn't forgetful. She'd been taken before he even got there. He told the officer everything. The custody case, the restraining orders, the court battles with Zoe's mother, the ruling, final and clean. Full custody granted to him, no contact without legal supervision, no exceptions. And yet here they were. His voice cracked when he got to the part about the daycare, how no one had questioned Greg, how no one had called, how his daughter had vanished from a perfectly normal day into a situation that could have ended God knows where. And then he looked at Frank, just for a second, and nodded. Not out of thanks, not yet, out of something closer to comprehension. They were both men who understood how thin the line was. The officers didn't waste time. They pulled Greg back into an interrogation room. When the door shut, the yelling didn't return. He'd stopped screaming. Maybe the truth had finally landed. A detective approached Frank again, this time with paperwork, statement forms, a timeline breakdown, descriptions of what Zoe said and what Greg had failed to prove. They were connecting the dots now, and the picture was getting uglier by the minute. They'd found forged documents in Greg's rental car, plane tickets, a list of border crossings flagged for weak checks, notes written in shorthand, a burner phone, a separate ID with Zoe's name misspelled but close enough to pass a lazy inspection, and a set of directions printed from a cheap home GPS unit with one destination circled 3 times, Miami International. They were leaving the country, not planning to, ready to. The detective said something under his breath. Frank didn't catch it, but the officer next to him did. If this guy had made it out of the county, he didn't finish the thought. Frank nodded. He didn't need it finished. Zoe stayed in the interview room for another hour, her father sitting beside her now. She answered questions slowly, clearly, never rushing. Every answer made the case tighter. Every detail cut deeper. Greg had promised her candy, had told her they were going on a vacation, had said her dad was too busy for her, that her mom missed her, that this would be their secret. When she'd said no, he'd ignored her. The officers didn't question the motive anymore. They focused on the plan. They had it now, clear as daylight. It wasn't a custody dispute. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated abduction. Frank didn't feel vindicated. He felt angry, because this had almost worked, because all the pieces had been in place, because Zoe had nearly disappeared, and without one silent gesture, one flash of palm and spread fingers, no one would have even known she was gone until it was too late. An officer approached him again, younger, maybe 25. He carried 2 coffees, offered one without asking. "You saved her," he said quietly. Frank shook his head. "She saved herself. I just listened." The officer didn't argue, just nodded and took a seat nearby as if needing to be close to the quiet for a moment. The minutes stretched. Night deepened. Eventually, Greg was pulled out in cuffs. This time he didn't shout. He looked smaller, emptier. As he passed by Zoe's father in the hallway, there was a brief moment, just 2 men passing, nothing said. The father didn't flinch, didn't glare, he didn't need to. Greg was led out the back, into a cruiser. No cameras, no reporters, just silence and cold metal. Frank stood, ready to leave. He'd said everything he could say, done everything he could do. But as he turned, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Zoe's dad. His voice was low, almost unsteady. "I don't know how to thank you." Frank opened his mouth to brush it off, but the man shook his head. "No, really, you didn't have to stop. Most people wouldn't have, but you did. And because of that, I get to bring my daughter home tonight. I get to have a daughter to bring home." Frank didn't reply. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't cheapen it. The man continued. "We're having a cookout this weekend. Nothing big, just family. Come by. I want you there. I need you there." Frank hesitated, but nodded. "Yeah, I'll come." As the man turned to go back to Zoe, Frank finally made it to the exit. The station behind him, full of reports and evidence and relief, held together by paperwork. And just before stepping into the night, he looked back one last time. Zoe sat in the waiting area, head resting against her father's shoulder. She looked up, found him, and gave the smallest nod. Not a thank you, not goodbye, just a connection, one that didn't need words. The backyard smelled like charcoal and sweet corn. Music floated low from an old speaker sitting crooked on the porch rail. Kids ran in uneven patterns across the patchy grass, voices sharp and wild, chasing balls and bubbles like nothing bad had ever happened. Frank stood near the grill nursing a cold soda he hadn't opened yet. He didn't know most of the people here. A couple of them nodded when they passed, gave him the kind of look people give when they've heard something about you but aren't sure if it's true. Nobody asked questions. Nobody needed to. His presence had already been explained. He was the reason Zoe was here at all. She was somewhere near the swing set now, tangled in a mess of children and plastic toys. Her dress today was blue, her shoes too big. Someone had painted a flower on her face. She laughed once, the kind of sound that cleared everything out of the air for a second. Frank watched from a distance and didn't move. "You okay out here?" a voice said beside him. Zoe's father. Same tired eyes, different energy. He looked lighter, like someone learning how to breathe again. Frank nodded. "I didn't expect this many people," he admitted. "They all wanted to meet you," the man said. "I told them not to bug you." "Appreciated." The man smiled, then looked out toward the yard, watched Zoe for a while. Something in his face shifted. "She hasn't let me out of her sight since we got home. Not once. Except today. Today she ran off to play." He paused. "I wasn't sure that was ever going to happen again." Frank didn't respond. The words weren't for him, not really. They just needed to be said. They stood in silence for a moment, both watching the same scene from different distances. Then the father turned to him again. "There's more to this than what the cops found," he said, quieter now. "Stuff I haven't really said out loud yet." Frank waited. She didn't just lose custody. Zoe's mom, she started unraveling after the court decision. Got erratic, angry, said the system stole her baby. "I didn't think she'd do something like this, but I was wrong. The police said they found a fake passport in her name, too. She wasn't just going to let Greg take Zoe out of the state. They were planning to vanish. Whole new life." He shook his head. 3 more hours, Frank. That's how close I was to losing her forever." Frank took a breath, let it out slow. "You did everything right," he said. "Yeah," the man said. "But you did more." They stood there for another beat before the man held out his drink. "Here's to watching, to stopping, to not walking away." Frank clinked his can against it, and for the first time since the diner, allowed a smile to break through. The afternoon slipped by in pieces. Someone brought out ribs, kids fought over popsicles, an aunt tried to start a game of cards and got ignored. It was all messy and loud and perfect. Real life, filling in the cracks. Frank didn't say much. He listened. He watched Zoe, how she acted around the other kids, how she kept one eye on her dad but didn't cling. The fear wasn't gone, but it had faded into something manageable. A bruise, not a wound. Later, she came over. Small steps. No one told her to. She just appeared. Frank knelt a little, but not too much. Let her speak first. "Thank you," she said. No mumbling, no whisper, just simple, steady words. He nodded. "You're really brave," he said. She shrugged, like that wasn't surprising news, then held something out, a bracelet made of rubber bands. Sloppy, bright, perfect. "For you," she said. Frank took it without hesitation. "I'll wear it," he promised. She smiled, then turned and ran off again, pulled back into the noise and chaos of a life that was finally hers again. Zoe's father came back later while Frank was packing up. "We're not done," he said. "The court's going to drag this out, more hearings, more people asking the same questions in 1,000 different ways." Frank nodded. He understood. "But no matter what happens, she's here. She's safe. Because you didn't ignore that moment. You didn't rationalize it away. You didn't wait." Frank didn't reply. Just looked out over the yard one more time. Zoe was spinning in a circle now, arms wide, laughing like she was trying to catch the sky. "I mean it," the man said. "Anytime you want to come by, you're part of this now, whether you like it or not." Frank let the words settle. They didn't feel like a burden. "Not tonight." "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I'd like that." They shook hands without ceremony. Then Frank climbed into his truck, engine rumbling to life as the sun started to drop. He pulled out slow, rolled past the yard one last time. Zoe waved from the porch. Her dad stood behind her, hand resting on the doorframe, the image framed like a photograph. Frank didn't honk, didn't shout goodbye. He just drove. And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead felt quiet. The police station looked different in daylight. Brighter, maybe. Less haunted. Frank stepped inside. Same walk, same door, same front desk. But something had shifted. Not in the place, in him. He was back to finalize his statement. There were always follow-ups, clarifications, boxes to check. Zoe's case wasn't closed, just rerouted onto court dockets and case files and long email chains between lawyers. But the immediate danger was done. That part belonged to the past. An officer waved him through. He was expected. Inside, things hummed like usual. People moving, typing, muttering into radios. A few nodded when they saw him. One of them smiled and pointed toward a back room. "She's here," the officer said. "Wanted to see you before the meeting." Frank stepped through the door and found Zoe sitting at a long conference table, swinging her feet over the edge. Her dad was beside her, paperwork in front of him, glasses pushed halfway up his forehead. He looked tired, the kind of tired you get from staying alert even when things are finally calm. Zoe looked up and grinned. "Hi." "Hey," Frank said. She pulled something out of her jacket pocket. A folded sheet of notebook paper torn from the edge. She handed it to him without a word. Inside was a drawing. Stick figures, 3 of them. One tall, with a square jaw and wild eyebrows. One medium-sized, arms crossed like a superhero. And one small, with a bright red dress and a crown. He pointed at the figure in the middle. "That you?" Zoe nodded proudly. "I'm the queen." Frank smiled and folded the paper carefully, slid it into his coat. "You drew me with hair," he said. She shrugged. "It's artistic." Her father laughed from across the table. Frank hadn't heard him laugh before. Not like that. They sat in the room together while the officers finalized the report. More interviews, more scans of Greg's forged documents, more tracing of digital footprints. Every turn made the story darker. The plans Greg and Zoe's mother had made weren't just reckless. They were long, calculated, and terrifying. The evidence showed intent, movement, money transfers, fake identities. This wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. And Zoe had slipped right through it. Not because of luck, not because the system worked, because she knew a signal, and someone happened to be looking. Before he left, Frank signed the last form. His signature looked sharp on the page, like it didn't belong to someone still unsure how he'd ended up part of all this. The officer thanked him again, said something about commendation, paperwork, recognition, local news maybe. Frank waved it off. He wasn't built for ceremonies. Never had been. Outside, the sun had climbed high. His truck sat where he left it, warmed by the morning. As he reached for the door, Zoe's dad caught up to him. "One more thing," he said, holding out a photo. Not official, not posed. Just Zoe, standing in front of the swing set, bracelet on her wrist, beaming at the camera like she owned the world. "We took this yesterday," he said. "She wanted you to have it." Frank looked at the photo a long time, then slid it into his glove compartment next to a stack of old maps and one worn-out flashlight. "Tell her thanks," he said, "and I'm still wearing the bracelet." Zoe's dad nodded, then stepped back. "You ever need anything," he said. "Anything. You call me." Frank gave a small nod, then climbed in and started the engine. He drove aimlessly for a while, letting the miles stretch. No destination, no noise but the hum of tires and the occasional buzz of a highway sign. He passed familiar exits, places he'd seen 100 times but never stopped. Now each one looked different. He thought about the thin threads holding days together, how easy it was to miss a moment, how the whole course of someone's life could tilt in one direction or another based on who looked up, who turned away, who stayed. Eventually, he pulled into a diner, not the same one, but close enough. Coffee. Quiet. A few booths and a jukebox stuck on a country song that didn't seem to bother anyone. He took a seat by the window and ordered black coffee, no sugar. The waitress poured it without a word. He thanked her. Then he looked up. At the counter, a young boy sat alone, swinging his legs, playing with the edge of a paper napkin, looked about 7, no adults nearby. Just a man 2 stools down, glancing over. Frank didn't jump, didn't assume, didn't stand. He just watched. Watched the boy, watched the man, watched the space between them. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Then a woman walked out from the restroom, called the boy's name, and he lit up, ran to her, napkin fluttering behind him. The man at the counter paid his bill and left. No harm, no story. But Frank didn't feel foolish for watching, because once you've seen it, that look, that signal, that moment of silent plea, you never unsee it. You carry it. You wait for it. Not out of fear, but out of awareness, because sometimes all it takes is being the one who doesn't look away. He finished his coffee, paid his bill, stepped back onto the road, no fanfare, no medals, just a man who stopped, and a girl who got to grow up because of it. Because one person stayed long enough to notice what mattered, and because sometimes noticing is everything.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We truly appreciate your presence and your attention. This wasn't just a story about danger or rescue. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest decisions can have the biggest impact. In a world that often moves too fast, simply choosing to slow down, to notice, to care, that can change everything. One quiet act of awareness can save a life. If this story moved you in any way, we'd love to know. To support our channel, all it takes is a quick like on the video. Leave a comment below letting us know which country you're watching from and how this story made you feel. Your thoughts mean a lot to us, and we read every single message. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. We've got more powerful journeys to share, and we'd be honored to have you with us. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you again for being here.